This video was sponsored by CuriosityStream. Right behind me stands Tinley Park, the last state-run psychiatric asylum opened in Illinois. It was built in 1958 on 213 acres with a capacity for 3,500 patients and grand aspirations to expand to 5,000 in the future. But only a handful of years later, this institution became practically obsolete. Its capacity dwindled to only 150 patients, and it stayed that way until its budget was completely cut in 2012. It's abandoned now, a real-life, decaying set piece for a post-apocalyptic film. I will not be going inside because, mostly because it's illegal, but also because they have 24/7 security on staff watching the place. But some adventurous folks have snuck inside and captured these doomed insides. It looks like something out of a horror scene. Its decrepit appearance might conjure images that are commonly associated with the asylum. Lobotomies, straitjackets, padded rooms. A hellhole where people lose their autonomy and are locked away for most of their lives. Many people might look at this facility's closing and say, good. It marks our cultural advancement towards a more humane way of treating people with mental illnesses. Better to not lock people away for their whole lives, right? But when I look at Tinley Park, I feel conflicted. Because, believe it or not, I think we kind of need asylums. I think that their disappearance has been a net negative for mental health care. And I hope that by the end of this video, you might see things the same way. So, let's take a deep dive into how we got to where we are today and where we need to go in the future. Psychiatric hospitals, or asylums, which I'll use interchangeably, are not really a modern concept. In the book that Allie and I wrote, which, you should totally check out, I mentioned that while Europe was going through their dark medieval times, the Islamic Golden Age was just starting, and out of that Golden Age came the first psychiatric ward and a proliferation of hospitals that treated the mentally ill. Now, you might think that during that time, the mentally ill were treated pretty barbarically. But the truth is that it was actually pretty progressive and nice. Mental illness was essentially treated the same way as any other sort of physical ailment. And so people received treatment in the form of medication and jobs training and music therapy. During that time, there are documents of European travelers who remarked at how nicely and kindly these lunatics were treated. However, these kinds of specialized services for lunatics were a pretty rare resource until about the early 1800s. It was at that point that standalone facilities called asylums were built in the United States and in Europe to provide long-term care for mentally ill inmates, as they were called at that time. Funny enough, these early asylums were actually part of a new, more humane attitude towards mental health. Because prior to asylums, the burden of care was placed on individual families to figure out how to provide for their mentally ill kin. And if families couldn't care for them, well, then the seriously mentally ill either languished on the street or were forced into prisons or were exploited by workhouses. And if the family did seek care, there was still often a big disparity depending on your financial status. The rich could afford specialized services for their sick family members at hospitals, while the poor had to rely on scant resources provided by religious institutions or by other charities. But even those services were, not great. Typical care for the mentally ill in 1700s America often involved putting people in madhouses where they were shackled to the wall in the basement, or put in solitary confinement, or were regularly beaten if they acted out. This kind of horrid treatment was largely due to how mental illness was seen at that time. The mentally ill were considered social deviants or moral misfits, suffering divine punishment for some inexcusable transgression. Essentially, if you were mentally ill, then you were a horrible person and you deserved it. So imagine going from that to the asylum. As the word implies, the asylum was built to be a refuge, a safe haven, a sanctuary for mentally afflicted people. These centers sprang up in the wake of the moral treatment movement, which marked a cultural shift in how we thought about mental health. No longer was lunacy the mark of a damned soul, but instead an illness that could be cured. In the United States, people like Benjamin Rush and Dorothy Dix championed this moral treatment, which believed that if you serve the mentally ill in a humane and kind way, in a hospital that's spacious and well ventilated and on beautiful grounds, well then these people would recover and eventually be cured, or at least have their symptoms alleviated. And luckily, this idea just took off, leading to the opening of over 100 state-run asylums around the United States. In these asylums, physical restraints were way less harsh and less frequent. And even more, in 1829, after a patient died from strangulation by his straitjacket, asylums enacted significant reforms that led to the reduction or total abolition of physical restraints. No solitary confinement, no regular beatings, no shackles, just quiet, secluded hospitals and peaceful countrysides where patients could relax and even work if they wanted to.
Hey, Micah here from the future. Quick note, I don't want to give the wrong impression and make it sound like the asylums of the early 1800s were some sort of mental health utopia. They definitely were progressive and provided top-notch care for their time, but they were still a product of their time. So what were once state-of-the-art treatments would these days be considered horrifying acts or straight up abuse, right? And there were a lot of practices and experimental treatments that would just be illegal today. But in the context of what we knew about mental health at that point, they were intended to be part of that compassionate, high caliber medical care that was promised by moral treatment. So in many ways, asylums did fulfill their promise of providing engaging, therapeutic, safe environments that genuinely helped many patients recover.
Unfortunately, this period of psychiatric enlightenment didn't last. By the end of the 1800s, asylums came under siege, and local governments redefined senility as a psychiatric problem and began funneling elderly residents from their almshouses into these state-run asylums so that they didn't have to pay for their care anymore. This exponentially increased the number of patients in each facility that went well above and beyond their physical and financial capacity. And then states refused to set aside the resources or the budget necessary to provide acceptable care. Not to mention the fact that asylums were specialized to treat individuals with serious mental illnesses like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major depressive disorder, not geriatric patients with Alzheimer's and dementia. So you can see how this might rapidly change the way that asylums operate. They became overpopulated, underfunded, and filled with patients that couldn't recover in an asylum setting. This improperly broke people's optimism around the effectiveness of moral treatment because the treatment in asylums no longer followed its original tenets. In these newly overcrowded, understaffed asylums of the late 1800s, patients stopped receiving high-quality, personalized care. The operators once again returned to the use of restraints, padded cells, and sedatives as a form of crowd control, and asylums became custodial rather than therapeutic settings. This, of course, was a pretty big departure from the original ethos of the asylum. At this point, they simply tried to survive. Asylums became bigger in order to meet demand, housing thousands of patients. Many of them also established on-site nurse training schools in order to address staff shortages. Nursing was a pretty new field at that time, and asylums became an important place to gain experience outside of the general hospital. This undoubtedly helped propel nursing as an established profession, but I can't help but feel that this also helps explain why there exists this stereotype of the evil asylum nurse, if many of them were trained in such poorly funded, overcrowded locations. And if those nurses were still in training, then they probably also lacked some of the skills and knowledge necessary to care for these patients, because, you're still learning. In any case, the degradation of asylums continued. By the early 1900s, the eugenics movement further shifted public sentiment around mental illness in a negative direction. Eugenicists believed that psychiatric disorders were a mark of inferior genetics and should be bred out of the population. So even though asylums had already begun to transform their services thanks to the influx of senile patients, this movement further transformed the asylum from a safe haven for the mentally ill to recover, instead to a holding facility where supposedly inferior people were segregated from the rest of society so that they couldn't reproduce. Over 18,000 people were forcefully sterilized in asylums during this time, which is probably one of the darkest times in asylum history.
I didn't mention this originally in the video because I couldn't think of a good place to talk about this, but it's worth mentioning that during this time, women were disproportionately represented in asylums, and this is because it was shockingly easy for men to have their wives or their daughters committed for pretty much any reason. The lunacy laws of the time included a lot of misogynistic diagnoses that supposedly required involuntary incarceration, including things like hysterics or female disease. And it wasn't just women, but any marginalized group pretty much of this era, including Native Americans or Black Americans, and pretty much anyone who didn't fit into mainstream American society. They were more often placed in asylums as a way of kind of getting them out of the way.
Unfortunately, this view of the mentally ill also allowed psychiatrists to experiment upon this population with a variety of new and untested medications and therapies, which I won't go into depth on here. I've already started a script, but with having a kid, I haven't been able to finish it. But when I do, I'll be uploading that over on Nebula, because I think it's a little bit too dark for YouTube. Follow that with the Great Depression and World War II, which cut state budgets across the board and produced staffing shortages at these institutions. And it's easy to see how asylums declined into appallingly unethical, corrupt, and detrimental places for patients. Luckily, during the war, some conscientious objectors were assigned to conduct their public service at these asylums and ended up revealing many abuses throughout the system. There were some patients who even died of starvation. And this led to significant reform in the 40s and 50s and the creation of the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIM, and the National Mental Health Foundation, which eventually became the National Association for Mental Health, or NAMI. But due to this increased attention, the legacy of asylums became that of poor living conditions, awful hygiene, and abusive treatment of patients. And those criticisms were right. Asylums were generally awful places to live at that point. They really seemed like prisons, operating with a medical veneer. So it's no surprise that by the 1950s and 60s, there was a huge movement calling for their closure. Asylums were at their height in 1955 with about 560,000 people living in them. But the winds had shifted, and things were about to change, and fast. So picture this, it's 1954, and a new drug called Thorazine is released that seems to be able to treat psychosis. Suddenly, some of the most severe symptoms could be ameliorated, and that made people think that maybe inpatient psychiatric care wasn't so necessary. This medication was also widely used in asylums, and there were opponents to the drug who viewed it as a kind of chemical straitjacket because of its fast-acting sedative effect. It also imparted some pretty gnarly side effects, particularly tardive dyskinesia, which worried many people and kicked off a whole anti-psychiatry movement that further demonized these large institutions and also psychiatry as a whole. Around this same time, a new system of nursing homes began to open to meet the needs of older patients, and there were more specialized programs for those who had suffered stroke or paralysis or head trauma. And then, In 1962, the best-selling novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was published, which told a dramatized and damning story of life in the asylum, which was informed in part by the author's experience working as an orderly on the night shift in one such facility. And in the backdrop of it all, the civil rights movement pushed forward, which sought to incorporate many disadvantaged or discriminated groups into mainstream society. With all of these diverse pressures, it's no surprise that there was public outcry and a political appetite to do something. I mean, President Kennedy's own sister, Rosemary Kennedy, had experienced significant brain damage after being lobotomized. So in 1963, he signed the Community Mental Health Act. With this law, he promised to replace custodial mental institutions with community mental health centers that would allow patients to live and get care in their local communities. And hey, it was supposed to be cheaper too, so the government could save some money. This change brought huge promise, and the move from asylums back into the community began almost immediately. Now, hearing all of this, you might wonder why I'm advocating for asylums, because those state-run psychiatric hospitals were pretty awful by the end. And in principle, it sounds fantastic to have individuals live locally and be integrated back into society while they're receiving care for all their mental health needs, right? But in practice, deinstitutionalization has been a train wreck. 2 years later, in 1965, the creation of Medicaid opened up a huge amount of federal funds for medical care, but it excluded coverage for inpatient care in institutions for mental disease. This was sort of a ploy to further encourage community mental health care. And this catalyst supercharged deinstitutionalization because now state governments were incentivized to save money by moving their patients out of their mental hospitals into other federally funded programs. The only problem is that Kennedy's mental health vision was never fully realized. Few community mental health centers were ever built, leading to a huge shortage in care. Patients who had lived in asylums sometimes for years or even decades were sometimes suddenly cut loose into the public and were expected to either sink or swim. Some got care from hospitals or nursing homes, which is kind of ironic and sad. And some could rely on their families or were lucky enough to find community mental health services. But many were just dumped onto the streets with nowhere to go. Seeing this extreme shortage, Jimmy Carter attempted to reform and restructure the community mental health model in 1980, but his act was promptly obliterated by Ronald Reagan the next year, who slashed the mental health spending budget by 30% and effectively ended all direct federal funding for the promised community mental health services by instead creating block grants for states, which were unfortunately woefully insufficient and were rarely spent on mental health, and eventually ended altogether. Hi.
How can I help you?
I'm just filming a short video.
Okay, are you almost done?
Yeah, I'm pretty close to being done.
Okay, so this is actually private property. And I understand that you're not technically on the premises.
Yeah.
But I do need you to be gone within the next hour.
So I just got told that I need to finish filming in the next hour, even though I'm not on their property. I guess they're getting nervous with me being here. There's something. It's kind of silly. All right, well, now you get this person in the background who will be camping out and watching me until I leave. If the goal of deinstitutionalization was simply to close inpatient services, then it's been a raging success. The number of psychiatric beds these days has dropped 95% from 1955 to 2005. And there's been a further 25% reduction in psychiatric hospitals since 1997. As of 2015, there are fewer than 200 state-run psychiatric hospitals in the whole country, leaving only 14 beds for every 100,000 people. And let me tell you, the services that are in place right now simply are not enough. These days, outpatient treatment for the severely ill is either completely unavailable or a month or more away. Nearly 40% of adults with serious mental illness receive zero treatment. And this leaves many of these people with two options: either rely on family or fend for yourself. It feels like we're going back to the 1700 standards, with serious mental illness being viewed as an individual problem rather than a societal responsibility. This has led to some really unfortunate, unintended consequences. Many families report feeling overwhelmed by the care of their mentally ill kin with no alternatives available to them. And this can breed feelings of resentment and guilt because families are faced with the impossible choice to either take 100% of their loved one's care into their hands or leave their loved one to their own devices. Even with family or community care, many of the seriously mentally ill end up on the streets. At minimum, 25% of unhoused Americans experience serious mental illness. And this exposes them to the vicious cycle of being relocated from the streets to hospitals or jails, and then are released back onto the streets without any new access to care. This is why our emergency rooms are jam-packed with acutely ill patients. This is why correctional facilities have become our country's largest psychiatric care providers. Around 20% of individuals in jails and 15% of individuals in prisons have a serious mental illness. That's around 356,000 people. These are not places for the seriously mentally ill. They are not meant to provide long-term care. Hospitals can offer only about 72 hours of care, and that care is expensive. And it's not meant to provide these patients with long-term resources to achieve independence or stability. And correctional facilities further stigmatize mental health and worsen symptoms, creating a cycle where the individual ends up in the facility repeatedly. Families are not trained to treat mental health disorders, nor do most of them have the resources to get their loved ones adequate long-term care. States have continued to tighten their budgets, and they cut $5 billion in mental health funding from 2009 to 2012, which, instead of saving money, has led to significantly more money being wasted on hospital beds, police encounters, jail space, and short-term emergency services.
Of course, these cuts to funding affect way more people than just the seriously mentally ill or psychiatric hospitals. We're talking like anything mental health related that's funded by the government. So it's no wonder that rates of depression and anxiety have steadily increased over the last century and have dramatically jumped during stressful moments in history like the Great Recession or the pandemic when rates tripled. But even outside of those extreme examples, we can clearly see a trend of more and more people experiencing depression over time. Why? Well, I got the answer for myself when I watched the documentary Sad People Factory over on CuriosityStream, where they explore the so-called depression epidemic. Now, if you're not familiar, CuriosityStream is an amazing documentary streaming service with thousands of titles about pretty much anything you could be interested in. Now, I'm the kind of guy who could just consume documentary after documentary, but what I love about CuriosityStream is every time I log on, I find something new. And CuriosityStream loves us. I mean, they seriously go out of their way to support educational creators like me, to the point that they've even partnered with Nebula, which is the platform that me and a bunch of my creator friends are building, where you can watch every single one of my new videos ad-free, plus extended and exclusive videos that we don't put on YouTube. So that video that I was teasing about the horrible things that happen in asylums, that'll go on there. Most recently, we added an exclusive video all about how baby brains are like adult brains on drugs. That's one that definitely would have been demonetized and crushed by the algorithm, but with Nebula, we actually have the space to experiment with different kinds of content. And it's just not me on there. You know, Nebula hosts tons of other awesome creators like Tom Scott, Braincraft, Minute Physics, H-Bomber Guy, Real Engineer. Listen, there's a lot of cool people on there, all right? But anyway, going back to what I was saying earlier, CuriosityStream has worked out an awesome deal, where if you go to curiositystream.com/neuro and sign up, not only do you get CuriosityStream, but you also get Nebula for free. And that's not a trial. You can have it as long as you're a CuriosityStream member. And CuriosityStream is offering 26% off their annual plan, which is less than $15 for the whole year. It's honestly the best deal in streaming. So click the link below to get both CuriosityStream and Nebula for less than $15 for the year. It's just a fantastic way to support me and Allie and the videos that we make. And it also supports all those other educational creators. So do it now. Go to curiositystream.com/neuro and do both of us a favor. All right, back to the video.
I guess this is a good time to mention that I've worked in several community programs that serve the severely mentally ill, and it was really fulfilling in a lot of ways. But despite that, it was also very exhausting, mostly because every day we were confronted with insufficiencies and major problems. Not enough money, not enough staff, not enough housing, long wait lists, or straight refusals to potential clients in real need because we were at capacity. These programs were specifically designed to serve people who were either homeless or recently incarcerated, and some of them did really well and thrived in these kinds of community services, but many struggled and ended up back in the vicious cycle. Despite having regular checkups, a place where they could live, medications, therapy, and a slew of other resources, a lot of these folks would end up back in either the emergency room or in a correctional facility due to their mental illness. From time to time, we would refer those clients that seemed most vulnerable and least able to care for themselves to these state psychiatric hospitals. But almost every time, they would be denied, no matter how severe the case was. There simply was not space. Now, I think that the deinstitutionalization movement was really well-intentioned, and I'm a firm supporter of placing people in the least restrictive setting needed for their care and betterment. We shouldn't be putting people into inpatient care who don't need it. And it's clear that community mental health care is a superior approach for many of the mentally ill, including many of the people who were in asylums back in the day. But it's also clear that the pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. As with any kind of medical care, we need a continuum of care that ranges from outpatient care to community services and supportive housing to inpatient medical care. It's not enough to just put everyone out in the community. It's estimated that 8 million Americans suffer from severe mental illness. Now, not all of those, or even most of those people, will require inpatient long-term care. However, it's important for us to recognize that the needs of the seriously mentally ill vary in nature and in intensity. And it's obvious that we need substantially more than what we have now, which is only about 43,000 beds, because many people who require that structured inpatient care can't get to it, or any services for that matter.
So just to clarify, when we're talking about these facilities and long-term care, we're not talking about committing people and never letting them leave. In fact, it's the opposite. The goal is to help people get better at this higher level of care so that then they can step down. So for many people, they may need just a few days, or maybe they need a few weeks to recover, and then they'd be handed off to a lower level of care. Now, some may need a few years, right? It just depends on the individual client situation. But these facilities are not holding facilities or custodial facilities.
So let me be clear that I am not nostalgic for the asylums of the 1950s, but we need to open up significantly more long-term inpatient psychiatric hospitals. We need to bring back asylums, but better. So what would that look like? I would like to return to the original meaning of the word asylum. It should be a sanctuary, a safe haven for vulnerable people. It should be a therapeutic place, not custodial, where the seriously mentally ill can stabilize and recover. Realistically speaking, this means a few things. I think it means having government-funded asylums that provide high-quality and ethically administered long-term psychiatric care. It means having insurance pay for it, particularly Medicaid. It means having regular oversight to prevent opportunities for abuse or harm to patients. The care should be patient-centered, evidence-based, and integrated. And Asylums probably shouldn't be isolated to the countryside, but instead more involved in the community and the public around them in low-stress conditions. I sort of imagine them being comparable to the modern memory wards that you might see for patients with dementia who now experience significantly improved quality of life thanks to environmental and medical and therapeutic advances. I'm imagining facilities that provide structure that include daily living skills, vocational skills, and recreational outlets. The priority would be essentially to ensure the highest level of patient safety, care, and autonomy. I don't have a business plan written. I don't have a business degree. I don't know how to implement these next generation asylums, but luckily, there are plenty of far more intelligent and informed people who have knowledge about patient care and ethical considerations and operations for these kinds of facilities. I know that some of you are listening to this and saying, that sounds expensive. And you're right. But you know what's even more expensive? Paying for prison beds, or police labor, or court costs and emergency room visits. Ultimately, research has found that it's almost always less expensive to actually address the underlying issues that result in individuals using these resources inappropriately, compared to continuing to ignore the problem and hope that it goes away. There will always be people who need extra mental health support. We can't continue to abandon the people who are most vulnerable in our country. Investing in the systems needed to support these individuals isn't just good for them. It's good for our communities, it's good for our families, it's good for our society and our humanity. One thing that I haven't addressed among the many things that I'm sure I have missed here is how this is only one small part of our mental health system. While this is the most costly and vulnerable mental health population, it's far from the only group that needs extra support. I mean, just as one example, many people, most people probably, don't access therapy because the cost of copays is too high. It's too much of a burden. Essentially, our country's whole mental health system needs to be revamped and better funded. But that's a video for another time. So this is where our story ends, right here in front of Tinley Park. As I stare at it now, I can't help but wonder whether it's time to dust off this ghost of a bygone era. But this time, do it better. Keep it on its original purpose, its original ethos. The field of counseling has come a long way since the 1950s. And with everything science and medicine are learning about the brain and how it works, I really think that right now there are ways to treat the severely mentally ill in these kinds of programs that will not only support the well-being of the individual, but will also contribute to a better and more equitable society. But what do you think? Where do you stand with asylums? I appreciate you watching all the way through to the end, and I'm actually really curious if I shifted your thinking at all. If you are watching this and you yourself have a family member who is suffering from a serious mental illness, I'd really be interested in hearing your opinion, because I feel like that would really help inform this discussion quite a bit. And I know that there's a lot that I wasn't able to talk about or didn't cover inside of this video. And so I'd like to continue the discussion down in the comments. So I'll see you down there. But until next time, I'm Micah. Think about it. All right. Now let's get the out of here, because this guy is on my ass.